Hello and welcome. India has a water problem. Now, it all depends on what data points you use to define it and how you understand it. Remember that a lot of water that India receives actually comes from monsoons, which you're of course familiar with. But also remember, very interestingly, that most of the rain that we get actually comes in just 100 hours in a single year. And there are many, many more fascinating data points about the supply side of water and more importantly, the demand side. All of us use and would want to use more than 100 liters of water per person per day. But as we consume more, as we become more urbanized and hundreds of millions of Indians will become urbanized, our demand for water will increase. Now, where is that water going to come from? It's a very, very not so simple answer to give. Also remember that the way in which we are getting our water, that is the supply side, is changing because among other things, monsoons are changing. A city like Chennai, which we're going to talk about shortly, used to be bereft of water and rainwater for decades, perhaps. I mean, in the real sense, and suddenly it was attacked with floods, and we went from almost nothing to plenty of it. And both situations were obviously a problem. And Chennai is, of course, just one example. There are many places across India and indeed the world which are facing such extreme weather situations because potentially because of climate change. But that's another part of the problem. But water in itself, the way we use it, the way we consume it, with the way we prepare for it, and most importantly, the way we do or do not account for it is very critical. So talking about all this is Mridula Ramesh in her new book, Watershed. It says how we destroyed India's water and how we can save it. So it's as much a look at what's gone wrong, but also tries to look at what lies ahead. And the book actually very, very interestingly and poignantly picks up along the way from her own experience in 2013 when water ran out in her home in Madurai in southern India. So the story in some ways, though it doesn't begin there, but I thought it would be a good point to start. So Mridula, tell us, when you ran out of water in your own home, which of course was a generational phenomenon, it had never happened before, you also used that to teach yourself about how to understand the problem of water scarcity, and then how to in some ways fight back. So let's begin from there, and then let's talk about the larger challenge of water that we face in India and what we can do about it.
Thank you, Govindraj. I think, until water disappeared from our house, water remained invisible, as it does for most of us. And that's sort of the premise behind the book. Indians got their water once. They really understood it. They understood what made it special. You mentioned one of the statistics that just blew my mind when I started working on this field, that India gets its water in just 100 hours. It's one of the most seasonal waters in the world. I think the World Resources Institute has compared seasonality of water across 166 countries, and India's water is more seasonal than 162 of them, right? And we understood it once. We had the distributed storage, the awareness, the demand management to cope with it. And then somewhere along the line, and the book traces exactly where and why and how, water became invisible, right? And we got used to just getting it, open the tap, you get the water, and you don't care about it. You don't see yourself as part of the problem or the solution. And you just use it until one day, as it did for me, it ran out, right? And then your life turns topsy-turvy and you sort of run pillar to post to figure out where to buy water, is that water of good quality, etc. And in my case, that really opened up the door to a different world, because water is best managed in a decentralized fashion. And if you can manage demand, you really, it's a very empowering thing to do, because once you say, okay, I acknowledge water and I try to understand it, and it's my responsibility, solving it is not as difficult a problem as it appears. So it is a grim topic, but it's not a hopeless one.
Right, and that's a very interesting way to look at it, Mridula, that, it's really my problem and not, let's say, in the apartment complex problem or the where I'm in Mumbai, the problem of the Bombay Municipal Corporation and so on. But and I'll come to that in a moment. But to walk us through what happened after that. I mean, because as I could read in the book, you really rolled up your sleeves and got down to figuring out one is the source of water, finding fresh sources of water, measuring it. And I think the measurement itself was highly enlightening.
Yeah, I think some people say, do you have OCD? I'm not sure about that, but I have 15 meters in the house, right? So we are fully aware of where we use our water, and what that helps in is really being able to do a surgical approach to solving the problem, because so many of us, so many of our municipalities, houses, right, apartment complexes, factories, you lose so much of your water to leaks, right? And if you have 2 meters on either point, you can actually figure out where you're losing water. And then solving it is really inexpensive, right? So that's number one. The second thing is the realization that you don't need the same quality of water for every use. What you drink is different from what you flush, right? What you flush is different from what you use in the garden. So in our house, we have 3 to 4 qualities of water. And it again sounds more complicated than it is. A neighborhood plumber will be able to do it. And the good news is apartment complexes, when they're beginning to get into this day zero kind of a situation that we did, are finding that it makes economical sense for them to actually invest in dual plumbing, to then use different qualities of water. So measurement, because you can't manage a black hole, right? So you need to know how much, where, and how you're using the water. So that's critical. Second is using different qualities of water. The third thing is, Tamil Nadu was a forerunner in sort of rainwater harvesting. But laws, right, they often remain paper laws unless they're evenly implemented. In our institute study, we've now spoken to well over 2,000 households. I think in the book we had data for 2,000 households. And what we found is nearly 50% of their rainwater harvesting didn't work, right? So they either didn't have it or it didn't work the way it was supposed to. And sadly, when we pushed them to ask why, many of them didn't even understand why they needed it to work. It was just like, okay, we need something to tick a box and meet the regulatory demand. But actually, if you can harvest rainwater, especially given what you mentioned, our rainwater is intense. It's getting more intense, by the way. And the number of rain days are going down in India because of climate change. So at the time when you need rainwater harvesting more than ever, because you use water every day, so much of it is broken. And again, it's not very difficult to fix, not expensive either.
Right. Right. So now let me take you back to the larger picture, of, at least in the context of India. So tell us about why and how we are facing a water crisis today, and what is the manifestation? I think, as you said, it's become so invisible that many of us don't realize it. In some parts, and other parts, even by income levels, as you pointed out in your book, it becomes very acute because people are paying through their noses to buy even bottles of water for daily consumption.
Yeah. So I think how visible water is to you lies partly on where you are, because India's water is so geographically varied. It also depends on where you sit on the economic ladder, right? For the wealthy, water is peripheral, both in floods, because they can escape it. Their homes are usually dry and their generators run. If you go down the economic ladder in the middle class, it's a crisis of uncertainty. Will water enter my home? And will I get water in the drought? And you need to understand that they look like different things, drought and flood, but they're actually the same phenomenon. The intensely volatile and variable water that is India's water, right? And then when you go down, to the economically vulnerable, I mean, the stories we've figured out in our institute is just tragic. And that story is just repeated in every city pretty much in India, right? You have to go beg, struggle, cudgel, bribe to get your, 2 buckets, 3 buckets of water. And I think I'd love to be able to give you a certain estimate. But the sad part is there's no reliable data, because the level of metering is so poor. And that's part of the problem, because if we can't have good data to agree that there is a problem, how are we going to summon the political will to take those kinds of decisions to actually solve the problem, right? Again, there's a huge variation, because some states, some municipalities get it and they're going ahead into solving it. But there are others who prefer to live in a black hole. So,
Right.
but to get to your problem, to answer your question, how serious is the problem? I think you know, a often quoted statistic, and one I've used in the book, is that India will be unable to meet half its water demand, right? And the truth of it is, today in 2021, and that's in 2030, in 2021, there are large parts of India, not large, there are parts of India that are living in day zero, right? They don't have enough water. Definitely in the summer, they're not going to be able to meet demand. And, factories are shutting down because there's not enough water. So it's already here.
Right. And just to kind of go back a little bit to history, which you've again dwelt considerably on, and mythology, how did we get here? You also used this very interesting statistic, and it was quite enlightening to me as a Mumbaikar, that there were 4,000 tanks, water tanks in this city, and similarly in many other cities across the country, which used to store water and which could not just be useful when there was flooding, but also were obviously repositories of water when you needed them, and they're all gone.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at history, let's go to Indus Valley civilization, right? So there's a fascinating set of studies that I've quoted in my book, where archaeobotanists looked at, hundreds of seed samples from across the Indus Valley settlements, okay, and over time, and looked at how and what and where Indus farmers grew their crops, right? So in places which had a lot, relatively more water, which had river water and snow melt, they would grow water profligate crops. So even traces of rice have been found there. But in places in Gujarat, which, one settlement relied on seasonal stream, and they got very little rain, like it gets less than 500 millimeters of rain even today, the farmers made do with millet. And they had, and over time their crops changed to keep pace with what water was available. Chanakya talks so eloquently on water, right? He talks of not only a water price, but a variable water price and a progressive water price. So the rich pay more. The rich farmers paid more, especially when they used technology to access water. When did we, the British came and said, there are two elements in it, right? So water-shaped cities and water-shaped crops. The British changed that first element by saying, no, human engineering can overcome water's variability. So I've spoken about the Punjab canal colonies and how they basically taught farmers over time that you could grow what you want, right? And canals will bring the water in, and railroads will truck the water out, and it doesn't really matter. The local water availability doesn't really matter. And then you come to Indian cities, and I've used the example of Patliputra and other ancient Indian cities. They were shaped by water. Usually they laid close to a perennial water source, and they respected water. So water-shaped cities. But when you came to British cities, like Kolkata, located in a cyclone-prone zone, you come to Chennai, no perennial river, and then the engineering would get water to the doorstep. But you fast forward ahead, the British leave, and then drought makes Indian leaders very keen to become food independent. And then comes the lure of the Green Revolution. But the problem there is you're focusing on crops like rice and wheat in places that didn't grow them, right? And then you don't put a price on water. India always had a price for water payable in kind. Once you pay in kind, you're automatically adjusting for seasonality, because if you have a drought, you pay less. But once you put it as a cash price, which is again a change that came with the British, and then with competitive populism that crept through in the 60s, that price, first just became flat and then got taken away. So water became invisible because there was this huge underground largesse that seemed infinite. It's running out.
Right, and you've also talked about, the fact that we need to focus on the farm sector as a bigger problem area when it comes to water consumption. I mean, we've been seeing in the last couple of years how growing sugarcane, for instance, is so disproportionately, disproportionate in terms of the consumption of water and the water it takes from potentially other users, including drinking water, which in many areas. So tell us about how bad this is, and again, to the extent that we can, how should we be putting more of our attention there?
I won't fully agree that it's the farm sector alone that we should focus on. Again, I'm sort of flipping it around and saying we're responsible for our water. So sure, if you're in the farm sector or you're farm adjacent, we can go ahead and focus on farms. But cities are equally vulnerable, businesses are equally vulnerable. So all three require attention, right? So we're not going to solve India's water crisis by just focusing on farms. We need to focus on cities and we need to focus on industry.
Sure.
But having said that, I think, the past year and all the things that happened then has taught us that policy may not help that much, right? I think, so let's just take Punjab, and I think everyone acknowledges that we need a change of cropping patterns, right? We should, if we grow sugarcane, we should grow it more efficiently. If we choose to grow rice in what is almost, a place, arid land, we should grow it more efficiently, or we should grow something else. But I think it's unfair and probably unrealistic to expect the change to start at the farmer end. What I say in the end of the book is actually, if you can start it at the demand end, and I give the example of the egg campaign and, the marketing push to get it different, and then extensive hand-holding is what has worked to make people more efficient in growing, whichever crop it is. You can grow paddy, but surely you can grow it in a more efficient manner. And today both of those are muted. So I think demand and then some degree of hand-holding, again, decentralized.
Right. And as you pointed out, in about 150 years, we've gone from 250 million people eating millets to about 1.3 billion people eating rice and wheat. And that itself is a big determiner, if one can call it that, of the way water is consumed.
Yeah, and we're growing the rice and wheat in the driest part of the country, right? We're not growing it in the places which get meters of rain in a matter of months. We're growing it in a place which gets between 500 and 700 millimeters of rain. And rice is a crop that needs double that, let alone wheat. So, that nothing else to me dramatically said we've forgotten our water in every which way possible, right? I think that is really there. And that really started with the procurement policies shaped by a drought. One of the people I spoke to said, we started this when we were we were water secure and food insecure. We're now trying to use the same horse to get us forward when we're water insecure and food secure. So truly something has to change, but you and I can talk about it. But I think the change has to come from the demand end. I'll give you one ray of hope. There is a startup that I'm going to invest in very shortly. It's in the book, wherein that startup works with even farmers in Punjab, 3,000 farmers, more than 3,000 farmers in Punjab, works with them through a local NGO and says, look, if you, and they put sensors there to actually monitor how much water they use. And if you get the water down, I can actually give you a sustainable tag, which gives you a premium for your rice, and you can export it at a premium. Small ray of hope and what might shape a way forward.
So it's almost like organic eggs and organic chicken.
Exactly. Or organic milk, which is hugely, it fetches a huge premium. But again, the whole thing of organic, sustainable, natural, all of that, it has to be very nuanced because I think done wrong, it can lead to disaster.
Right. Another point that you've made, and I would like you to articulate it a little more, is the impact of water or its scarcity on gender, and particularly on gender and women in India. Tell us about that, and is that another invisible challenge in many ways?
Yeah, I think it is, right? Because when we spoke, I mean, water is female, and that's what I call it in the book, because the women in the household are responsible for gathering water. That's all very easy if you live in an apartment and you turn on your tap and the water flows in. But for many women, that involves, so in our study, let me just tell you what we found. Most people get water 2 to 3 times a week for a few hours a day. In the summer and during El Nino years, which are drought years, many of them get water once in 4 days, in the middle of the night for a couple of hours. So they need to always be on alert, right? So imagine you're sleeping at, say, midnight, and at 2 o'clock you have to get up, rush. You really have to nudge people, push, shove, bribe the driver, get your however much water you can carry, right? And the kind of rationing we saw when people couldn't get enough water was just sickening, because and any health impact of that, or consequence of that, fell on the woman, because she is again responsible for taking care of the people in her house, right? And the other thing is, we are waking up to the dangers of lost sleep as a society. We know it through personal experience. If we don't get a good night's sleep, we're groggy, we are irritable, we're less productive, we're less creative at work. If the women are taking the hit on their water, they become unproductive employees, less desirable employees. And India's workforce participation, right, is urban workforce participation. This really, really shocked me. Tamil Nadu's urban workforce participation is less than Saudi Arabia's. It's like it couldn't be starker than that. I'm not saying water is the only or even primary reason for this, but it is certainly gives you an angle to think about on why this might be so, right? And why happiness has been sort of falling if you're just insecure and anxious about water all the time, and amongst other things. That's not going to help either. I mean, and I read about a story where women, and this is rich in its irony, right? So the Vaitarna Dam is the dam that supplies Bombay with its water. So it's this huge big dam, right? So this village, which is 1 kilometer or a little more from the Vaitarna Dam, the water scarcity is so intense that women rappel down a well, wait for the water to ooze out, and then gather it and climb back up. I think it's tells you why. I think I don't know whether it's invisible or not, but it's definitely a major problem.
Right. You've talked about the challenges and you've talked about how we can save it. And I think you defined your response or solutions in 2 or 3 ways. One is, of course, policy, but equally you've talked about, entrepreneurship and individual innovation, which, of course, leads to the question of how do you bring it all together and scale. But you're also talking about understanding the problem and then sort of farming out the solution. So industry has to resolve its own problems. Farm, as you said, has to resolve its own problems, and individual consumers and those of us in urban environments have to resolve it in our own way. So how optimistic are you of all these things happening in the time period that we're not going to see day zero happening in more and more cities? And before I kind of hand it to you, I thought that was a very interesting example that you quoted, where you said that Cape Town in South Africa ran out of water in 2018, and they called it day zero. But it only ran out of what they call the municipal water, whereas it always had groundwater. In Chennai in 2019, it ran out of water, or it became close to day zero. But that it ran out of both groundwater as well as municipal water or corporation water.
Yeah, I think our day zero is much worse, right? The day zero in South Africa has a lot of political overtones also, but our day zero is really frightening because we don't have municipal water and we don't have groundwater and we're just bone dry. But to answer your question, right, there is hope and fear, right? And I think I go through the politics of why is it politically resonant? And the short answer is not as much as one would like. And therefore, the action has to be decentralized. So when the pain is highest, people hopefully will do something. And let me give you a very clear example of Chennai and Madurai, because when Chennai had its day zero moment, Madurai also had its day zero moment. And I think we've spoken about this, that metros get a lot of attention, but other cities and other towns and villages also suffer. But the good thing is people are finally waking up to the glory of tanks, right? Tanks or lakes, urban lakes. And the encroachment is being taken less, more seriously by courts. People are not being given a free pass, so to speak. And sort of the rejuvenation of tanks is moving up the priority and the urgency of things. And this really helps a lot, because again, in our institute, when we did our tank studies, we studied 100 tanks, and we found that, if you live next to a functional tank or a lake, the groundwater is about 200 feet higher than it would otherwise be. So that talks to your day zero very clearly. But if you rejuvenate a dysfunctional tank or a lake, the water levels go up, right? Quite substantially. It varies by how effective it was, etc. But and those in Madurai, when at the time of our study, we studied 19 tanks, and it has helped both with the flooding and with the drought. So that is definitely something that's happening. In other areas like changing our crop patterns, etc., I think we've had less success. But I think, again, hopefully that should be demand related. And unfortunately, some areas will run out of groundwater and just not have enough water to grow. That's a slightly more problematic future to face, but only hope and pray.
Right. You've spent a chapter talking about, or rather describing a fairly dystopian future, 2030. Is that a year which is only now 8 years away? Is that your cutoff in some ways, where you feel that it's all going to, go to seed?
No, this was actually, when I tried to look at what might transpire, it's already happening, and it's only going to accelerate. So I talk about this geoengineering, wherein people try to cool the planet, and you can see that happening, right? But unfortunately, every time something like that happens, they're essentially mimicking a volcanic eruption, and every time that happens, the world has seen famine. So that's the scenario that I paint. And then the moment you see famine, you see migration into cities. The moment you see migration into cities, we have nowhere close to the infrastructure that we need to treat our sewage. So you'll start seeing waterborne diseases. Many of us are facing some kind of a lockdown now because of the third wave, the Omicron or Omi Delta, right, whatever the variant is called now. But how do you lock down sewage, right? You just can't lock it down. And then you see how that spreads, and given the variability of India's water. So if you have drought, a few years down, you're going to have intense rainfall, because that's just how the water works. And then you can start seeing flooding, which, the kind of flooding that you could see makes recent Bombay floods or Chennai floods or any other flood look mild in comparison. So, that I think we've sort of really forgotten, right? And this has happened before in the past. The climate has changed, and you've seen famine. I speak of, when famine stalked Delhi, and there were even reports of cannibalism because it was so bone dry. Or there were floods where it rained for it rained so much in Pataliputra that, one of the crown jewels of the ancient world just got overwhelmed by floods. So you've seen it time and again in Indian history, and we've forgotten. And that's not a good thing to do, especially because the climate is warming. And we appear to have crossed certain climate thresholds, which makes it all the more worrisome.
Right, and the time to act is now. A very somber note to end on, but very important nevertheless. Mridula Ramesh, thank you so much for joining me, and all the best for your book.
Thank you, Govindraj.